My name, by the way, is Lisa Appignanesi, and along with the Literature Department's Lara Weigel, who's sitting right there, I'm the convener of this series, though I'm not the best voice around, it seems. Anyhow, tonight we're going to be exploring the hows and whys of remembering and forgetting, that whole fascinating sphere of memory, so proximate in many of its workings and indeed its inner experience to the imagination. And I think that's the rub of the field, this proximity. It's an area of the mind I've been fascinated by ever since I read how Proust's little Marcel, his fictional self, on waking from sleep, had to put his self, his identity, back together again from the familiar and remembered objects in his room, having lost this identity in a dream. And indeed later how he retrieved a whole lost, unredeemable world in the crumbling of a Madeleine through the sense experience of that taste and smell. Needless to say, the exploration of memory seems to have worked its way into quite a few of my books, my novels as well as my non-fiction, something Stephen, I think, you know as well. It seems to me particularly appropriate that in these discussions we've come to the subject of memory as a great climax. With my historian's hat on, it's clear to me that it was the study of the many facets of memory which in fact spurred the birth of neuroscience in its first incarnation at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. At that time, too, there was a great moment of cross-fertilization between the various disciplines, between what we would now call neurology, and was indeed then also called neurology, though reflected slightly differently, chemistry, psychology, the brain anatomists came in, the philosophers came in, the alienists came in, writers, and indeed the public all pondered the subject of memory and where the I might go when it doesn't remember, when it goes off into the world of sleep or dreams or other selves. Indeed, the philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, has located memory as the place where the soul came to reside for a secularizing 20th century. Memory as the site of our inner as well as our collective identity. Back then, around 1900, psychologist Pierre Janet and many others worried over altered states and why the same person couldn't remember what happened in one state when she was in the other. The great William James explored what he called primary and secondary memory processes. Freud talked of the way in which his so-called hysterics fell ill of reminiscences, that is, symptoms began to stand in for what had been forgotten or repressed by the conscious mind. And he also investigated the everyday errors of memory, the slips and forgettings humans were prone to, as well as the false memories that can to some seem truer than the real. Still others looked for lesions and brain areas to determine where memory, that key to the mind, was located. Much of this, of course, has changed, and we have far more sophisticated technologies to look at these things on. But I think some of the conceptual areas have not changed all that much, except in terminology. So I'm thrilled that we have with us a panel of our most exciting minds, scientific and artistic, to tease out and discuss the workings of memory and its lacks. Since in this particular area of the mind, as indeed in so many others, it's often the lacks, the distortions, the disorders and deviations, the forgettings, in this case, which illuminate all the rest. So let me introduce our extraordinary panel to you. First of all, Stephen Monroe, who's sitting right here next to me, is a biochemist by training, and he really is the doyen of memory scientists. His work has been at the center of the explosion of neuroscience over the last 25 years or so. His long-term work with chicks at the Open University Brain and Behavior Lab, which he had over many years, provided some of our key biological insights into remembering and learning. He's done a great deal of work on the neuroscience of Alzheimer's as well. Amongst many other books, The Making of Memory is a basic text in the field, and it's also one I recommend because it's so very readable. And most recently, he and Hilary Rose, his wife and indeed his long-term intellectual partner, have written a book together called Genes, Cells, and Brains. I have to confess that I shadowed Stephen Rose and the people in his lab for some years, some time back, and we did make a little appearance of kind in this transformed hero of the memory man. Michael Kopelman, sitting next to him is Professor of Neuropsychiatry here at King's College London at the Institute of Psychiatry, and he runs a neuropsychiatry and memory disorders clinic at St. Thomas's Hospital. He's been co-editor and co-author of a number of books, including the Handbook of Memory Disorders, Leishman's Organic Psychiatry, and Forensic Neuropsychology in Practice, an area I'm particularly interested in at the moment. He's president of the International Neuropsychiatric Association and the British Academy of Forensic Scientists. And his clinical and research interests include the nature of retrograde amnesia, which I think we'll be talking about tonight, confabulation, and psychogenic amnesia. Ian Bostridge, sitting next to him, needs very little introduction. He's one of our very great tenors whose talents have taken him to the leading opera houses and concert halls of the world. There's in fact a concert coming up in about 10 days' time at, is it the Wigmore Hall? Where he'll be singing. His recordings have won him all the major international prizes, and the fact that he's here with us tonight could only have to do with the fact that he has a doctor in front of his name as well, and is in fact hiding a fine historian of science beneath all his song. Those of you who have a memory intact will remember Simon McBurney, who's sitting next to him, because his film Presence served as an au revoir to the series, because he was then in the alternate stay, I believe, in Amsterdam, rehearsing the Magic Flute, which is going to come to the ENO in November. He's one of our leading theatre magicians, and his directorial work with Complicite has reinvented theatre in Britain over the last decades. One of his productions wore the title Mnemonic. The way we're going to run things tonight is that each of them will speak up to some 10 minutes, and then we will have discussion, including you as well. Stephen, will you begin by giving us a picture of this shifting terrain of memory in the neurosciences? I'm going to take this mic with me. Oh, is this the mic that... No, you've got one.
Please, let me just check. Can you hear me? No. Can you do something about this? Any better now? Okay. Well, in 10 minutes, mine is the warm-up act, the boring bit of neuroscience, before the interesting things start in the rest of the contributors of the plot this evening. And my task is to take a fairly formidable one through more than a century of research from the perspective of a molecular and cellular neuroscientist on memory. And you may find that the way that I talk about memory will therefore be very different from the way that the rest of the people on the panel talk about it. And that's something that I hope we'll be able to explore as time goes on. But I thought I'd start with one of my favourite, rather put-upon heroines from Jane Austen, Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. Because what she has to say about memory, and I'm not going to read it to you because I'm sure you can read it yourselves, seems to me to be the key to the reasons why many of us as researchers have over the years tried to explore memory from the point of view of its neuroscience. It's peculiarly past finding out, she says, and I'm going to leave you with the conclusion that after a century plus of memory research, it's still peculiarly past finding out. But let me begin, therefore, with a dissection of memory as neuroscientists and cognitive scientists understand it at the moment. We use it as a global word, but that doesn't mean that there are not many different forms of memory. And this is a classical dissection and taxonomy of memory which is used in the field. The short versus the long-term memory, the fact that you can remember a telephone number for a few minutes and then forget it afterwards. But on the other hand, most of us can remember things that happened in our 4th, 5th, 6th years. In my case, some 70 years after they actually happened. There's a working versus a reference memory terminology which is used. The memory we're using at this particular moment, what I'm using in order to string these sentences together, as opposed to the reference memory, everything that's stacked up somewhere back in my mind that I can draw. Then there's recall versus recognition. I last saw Ian Bostridge coming out of the party at least at Appignanesi just before Christmas. And yet he and I recognised one another right away. And that's a very surprising phenomenon. Perhaps it isn't a surprising phenomenon for scientists, it ought to be, because every single molecule in Ian's body is turned over, and in mine over that period of time. We still remain the same. Asked to describe one another, well, I doubt that he could describe me. I know him because I've seen this before. But nonetheless, we recognise one another. So recognition versus recall is actually another form of the dissection of the taxonomy of memory. Then there's procedural versus declarative. Procedural is knowing how to do something, how to ride a bicycle. Declarative is knowing that a bicycle is a bicycle. And then finally, semantic, knowing, for example, the names of the days of the week, versus episodic or autobiographical. That is remembering what I did last Wednesday. That is my own personalised memory. And most of us, when we're talking about memory, we're talking about these personal, individual bits of memory. We're not talking about these global things that we tend to take for granted. They're also part of what has to be studied in the form of memory. Okay, so the starting problem, therefore, is, are all these types of memory involve the same sorts of brain processes? We take for granted, and there are two words that memory researchers use now. I think I want to deconstruct them later on. But in some way, when learning takes place, when experience takes place, memories are encoded, they're stored in the brain. And these two words, encoding of memory and storage of memory, are a bit like computer words, and that's one of the confusions and the difficulties in this field. Because the one thing that brain memory is not like, and we all know this, is like a computer memory. Computers are fast and accurate and stupid. Memories deal in meaning and personal experience in a much richer and slower and more complicated sort of way. So, where should we start to look at, as a neuroscientist, for memory in the brain? And there are two sorts of ways of doing this. One is to look, as Lisa hinted at, as what happens if there are lesions in the brain. If there's a hole in the brain, what happens to memory if particular regions are taken apart? And the key discovery, both of the two key discoveries that I wanted to talk about, which have shaped the whole of the future, the past and the present future of memory research, started in Canada in around 1950. And in Canada in 1950, a particular individual was treated for intractable epilepsy, an individual known to all neuroscientists as HM. And this blue structure in the rising out of the brain there, not really blue in real life, but false colour, is an area of the brain called the hippocampus. HM had his hippocampus and regions around it removed to treat epilepsy. And something very extraordinary and disastrous happened to him as a result. And this is a description of the result of the lesion to HM's hippocampus. Essentially, he remembered everything perfectly well until the date of his actual operation, surgery. Anything after the surgery, he could not remember at all. So he remembered his date of birth, his past life, and so on. But once the surgery had happened, and this is his own description, which I think is actually quite haunting, he lost any capacity to store or to retain memory. Every day, he says, is alone by itself. Whatever enjoyment I've had, whatever sorrow I've had. Our own impression is that many events fade for him long before the day is over. And this is an extraordinary account of what happens if people retain long-term memory but no longer have the capacity of short-term memory or new memories. And it focused attention of neuroscientists on the hippocampus. It's a region of the brain which is essential for memory formation. So that was the first key finding which focused a particular region, understanding a particular region of the brain and memory. The next key issue, which took place in around the same sort of area, a theoretical approach to memory, took place also in 1949 in Canada. And it was a hypothesis about how memories might be stored in the brain, hippocampus or anywhere else. What's the picture before that? There was going to be a picture of neurons in the brain there, but we don't really need it. All I want to remind you of is that the brain is a forest of nerve cells, of something like in the cerebral cortex here, 100 billion different nerve cells with 100 trillion different connections between them. And the idea proposed by the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb, who afterwards had an unsavory career liaising with the CIA on a whole sort of rather unsavory experiments. But nonetheless, neuroscientists tend to forget Hebb's later history and concentrate on the hypothesis. Hebb's hypothesis was that in order to store memories in the brain, you have to make connections. You have to rebuild connections between one cell and another. And in rebuilding those connections, those synaptic connections between one cell and another, you store new patterns of information within the brain. And the whole tenor, therefore, of molecular and cellular research on memory since Hebb formulated this hypothesis in 1948-1949 was to try to investigate whether the brain could, in fact, respond by changing its structures as a consequence of new experience of learning and memory. And if the next slide works, yes, it does. This is a classical example, and it's from quite old research now, and it shows you what can actually happen in the brain as a result of experience. On the left-hand side of the pictures that you're seeing there is a dendrite, one of the connections between one nerve cell and another. And it has a small number of spines, little protuberances from it. Its companion on the right-hand side, as you'll see, is actually densely scattered with those spines. And that is simply the result of training animal on a rat in this particular case on specific tasks, a new growth of spines, a new growth of connections. This is what's called, and it's a very popular area of research at the moment, neuroplasticity. So the brain can respond to experience, to learning and to other forms of experience by changing structures and making new connections. Each of those little spines that you see coming out of the process is a new connection between one cell and another. So in that sense, Hebb's hypothesis has been proven, and many of us have spent the last 30 or 40 years trying to dissect the molecular and cellular sequence through which the brain responds by remolding its synapses, its connections in this sort of way. And I'm not going to, although it's the love of my researching life, I'm not going to walk you through any of that at the moment. I've only got about a couple of minutes to go. So I want to turn from the issue of how memories are encoded in the brain to the second issue, of that is, how do we then remember things subsequently? Everything that the molecular and cellular biologists do is about training animals and showing that there are changes as a result of the training. Now we're going to move from non-human animals to humans and ask what happens if someone is asked to remember something. And these are some experiments which Lisa will know well, because her head is one of the ones that you're going to see in a moment. This is a device called a magnetoencephalogram, and I won't go into the technology of it, but what it does is detect the minute magnetic fields around the brain, something like a billionth of the Earth's magnetic field. And it does this millisecond by millisecond. So we can put a person in this machine and essentially ask them to remember something. And we asked them very specifically to remember. In the experiments that we did, we wanted to look at standard autobiographical memory, so we took a group of us, Hilary who's in the audience, Lisa, myself as well, on a virtual supermarket tour through a Sainsbury's supermarket, and asked, as the tour stopped at various points, to ask and show various products, to choose which one on the basis of your past memory you would like to buy at that particular moment. Very artificial experiment, but there it is. Now, all I wanted to show you from this picture here is what happens in the first second in the brain when someone is asked to remember this particular task. When you're reading these pictures, you're looking at the brain from the top downwards. So the top point of there is the nose, and the bottom is the head, is the back of the head here. And we're looking at a time sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the first thing that happens as someone's asked to remember this in the first second is that the visual cortex at the back of the head lights up. The next thing that happens, and that's the top right there, is a region of the brain which we know is associated with memory. In the left temporal cortex lights up. Then bottom left there another region of the brain, an area that we know is associated with naming. You can see people in the machine trying to name the objects they're looking at. And finally, in the bottom right here, the region of the brain here that lights up, a region called the right parietal cortex, is a region that lights up if and only if a person makes a memory and a positive choice as a result of it. In our case, choosing to buy Coke rather than Pepsi, or Pepsi rather than Coke. The point of showing you this is to show the extreme dynamism that's going on in the brain during that very first second when you're asked to remember something. And this leads me to the very last point that I want to make, and that is it relates to the paradoxes of memory. The paradoxes of memory are these. We can show that learning changes connections in the brain, in the hippocampus, for example. But memories don't remain in the hippocampus. If they'd remained in the hippocampus, HM's memories from all his past history would have disappeared as well, and they haven't, they were still there. So that says that within the brain itself, memory is dynamic and unstable. And one of the very exciting things that's come out of research over the last 10 or 15 years was to remake an old finding, and that is the extreme lability and dynamism of memory. So every time we remember something, we remember the last time we remember it. You're not remembering the earlier event. Every time we are creating memories. They're not fixed like computer memories. They're molded by our own experience each time they're remade, each time new connections actually happen. And this entire dynamism is something that is very difficult to understand and get to grips with as neuroscientists, but it's central to our understanding, I think, of the way that brains and memories work. So memories are labeled, their memories dynamic. And I've shown you what happens in the brain when we're asked to remember something. So we have, ultimately, the paradox of the brain, localized, non-localized, static, dynamic, and for me, the great question after a lifetime of trying to research memory is, where is memory between the time that we learn and the time that we remember? And that's the question, I think, which I'd like to leave you with. And just to finish by saying, yes, indeed, Fanny Price was right.
For that, I just have to add a little footnote to this. What I remember of that experiment, well, I remember two things. One is that we couldn't do it with the women because there was something that set the machine off in the wrong way. And what set the machine off in the wrong way was the fact that women sometimes wear underwired bras. And it took a long time for the neuroscience to get this right. The second thing that I remember is that after I had this picture of my brain shopping, I was told, I don't know if it was by you or one of your assistants, that I shopped like a man, whereas my partner shopped like a woman. I got very worried about this gendered appraisal. We can leave that for later. Michael Kopelman. That's just to tell you about the workings of memory. There were many more important things going on.
Okay, I'm going to show you a video clip. The reason for doing this is I want to banish from your minds anything you've got from Hollywood. I apologise for if any of you have seen this before, but I can't show you my patients. This patient happens to be in the public domain. So could we have the video clip, please?
Yeah, gosh, his face is soggy. It's really wet, isn't it? Yeah. How long's it been? Yeah, how long's it been? Just don't worry about views now. Just how long was that?
How long what?
How long did they take to sort of get through to that point?
You've been ill for 12 days before you went into hospital.
Yeah. And then they got into the hospital. Could they analyse what it was?
It took 11 hours once you got into hospital to work out what it was.
God, that's rather exceptional, isn't it?
Yes.
How many cases do they have of this a year?
Hardly any.
Where did I get it from?
I don't know.
How many cases a year?
About 50.
1 per million.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it? People die.
At the time when these pictures were taken, Clive was in full possession of all his faculties. In fact, he had a good memory and exceptional skills in music. A brain scan would have shown no abnormalities whatsoever. In March 1985, the previously inactive virus of herpes simplex suddenly began to multiply inside his nervous system. It attacked and irreversibly damaged certain parts of his brain. The right temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and in particular the left temporal lobe. All these areas became scarred and the holes filled up with fluid. After this almost fatal illness, physical health returned to normal, except for occasional seizures which take the form of belching. But Clive is left with a dense and almost impenetrable amnesia. Although Clive had seen his wife earlier that morning, he greeted her as if it was the first time in years.
Come and sit down.
It was like dying and being dead.
Not dead.
It feels like it. I've never seen it, never touched anything. What's it like? What's it like when you're dead, you know?
I haven't tried it, sweetie.
Neither have I. I don't know whether any consciousness is actually transferred to it, but if you never see anything, there's anything I've touched, not the sense of being in connection with anything at all. It's like being dead.
I know. Kiss a kiss. It's lovely to see you.
You are all to see you. You've no idea how much better it is to see you.
Look, I've got an organ.
I used to play it.
Did you?
Yes, when I was a kid.
Do you want to open it? I'll switch it on.
Have I been playing at all?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes. You played quite a lot.
Really?
We've got some friends here, actually, who could sing something with you. No?
Well, that's too much.
No. I'll get you some keyboard music, but you
Just a keyboard music.
twiddle around a
Yes, I
bit.
can do that.
Okay. Sweet pie. Look who's here.
It's hard to say whether the broad smile with which he greets a member of his old choir really means that he recognizes her.
Your looks belie you then, you look wonderful.
Perhaps awfully well is what I mean.
Linda would sing something with you, because you know how my voice is.
Do
you be a...
Do you know... How about that one?
Yeah, that's fine,
Okay.
yeah.
If my complaints could pass...
Okay. Well, I show that piece because it illustrates many aspects of memory. His memory for the immediate few seconds, what William James called the specious present, is preserved. If it wasn't, he couldn't conduct a conversation. But for the reasons that Stephen was describing, he cannot lay down a continuous record of new episodes. And in fact, we've done more contemporary brain scans, and he's got massive holes where the memory centres are in the medial temporal lobes. On the other hand, his past knowledge, who his wife is, about Renaissance composers, is intact. And as you saw, he can still play the organ, even though he doesn't know he's done so recently. And he's much more relaxed when he's playing the organ than when he's struggling in everyday life. In fact, my daughter and I went to visit him in the home he was staying at. He was on the first floor, had a large room, he had a grand piano in there, and as we arrived, went up the stairs, he was playing the piano. 10 minutes into the conversation, I referred to this. Haven't played the piano since I became ill. I said, but I heard you coming up the stairs. Haven't played the piano since I became ill. And he got quite irritable. Now, other patients, he had encephalitis, other kinds of diseases can cause severe memory loss. loss of oxygen to the brain, as in cardiac arrest, certain types of head injuries, certain types of stroke, heavy drinking over many years. In fact, I saw a patient who had a cardiac arrest, was difficult to resuscitate. When she came round, she was profoundly amnesic. She had had a sex change 5 years earlier. And when she came round, she was so amnesic, she didn't remember she'd had a sex change. And she went back to assuming a male identity and her previous male name. And it took several weeks or months before she reassumed a female identity. Clive is a relatively pure case of memory disorder. Most patients have concomitant other cognitive or behavioural problems. They may have difficulty planning or organising themselves. They may have difficulty in naming or comprehending information. This occurs, for example, in head injury or in dementia. And although one of the things that grouses I have about the dementia strategy is that people assume that all forms of memory disorders are dementia. They're not. There are a lot of people, young people with head injury or encephalitis who are struggling to survive and are very poorly provided for. There was brief mention of confabulation. Confabulation is almost the opposite of memory disorder, but it occurs alongside memory disorder. You come into the room and the patient is telling you all manner of nonsense. They describe very graphically how mum and dad visited last night and took them for a meal and what they ate and where they went, and then you discover that mum's been dead 10 years and dad's been dead 24 years. That's called confabulation, and we now know that it results from damage to a filter mechanism in the frontal regions of the brain. And interestingly, sometimes it consists of real memories jumbled up and retrieved inappropriately, and at other times it's coloured by emotional factors or motivational factors. So that Martin Conway, for example, described a patient whose confabulations made bearable the largely indifferent attitude of her relatives. This, coupled with her glowing views of lengthy time periods from her past, transformed the present into a time of harmony and comfort, rather than discord and distress. Her often repeated statement that she had had wonderful friends in the past attested to this. Negative events were recast in a better light by beliefs arising from her confabulations. Actually, this could be a description of Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire, but it's actually a real person. There are also psychological forms of amnesia. You can have gaps in your memory if you've experienced some trauma. Victims of rape, victims of child sexual abuse often have gaps in their memory. And just occasionally, you get patients who, for psychological or emotional reasons, lose all their memories and even forget who they are. That's the stuff of Hollywood. As it happens, on Tuesday, I was honoured to go and watch Nicole Kidman and Colin Firth filming their latest movie, which is indeed on amnesia. And I was delighted to learn that Nicole Kidman had been watching the Clive Wearing film as part of her preparation. I had put it in the way of the director. There's also was a line in the film, I think I can reveal this. They're talking about false memories, and in the original script, it said, this is an example of hysteria. It now says, or I hope it says, this is an example of confabulation. So if and when you go to that film, I want each of you to turn to your neighbour, husband, wife, partner, illicit paramour, whoever, and to say, at that point, that's the line that Mike Kopelman wrote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll take that up later.
Ian, do you want to stand?
No, I'm fine with me. I was very excited when Lisa asked me to do this because, as she pointed towards, I'm a sort of academic manqué, so the opportunity to be on a panel with academics seemed like an opportunity for a real boost to my singer's ego, because people often think tenors have had their brains extracted. I think it was Toscanini who said it was a definite problem for tenors. But then I spent a lot of time sort of reading around this subject and thinking that actually, especially on such a distinguished panel, there wasn't anything I could really say of great intelligence. So I thought the best thing I could do really was just to speak about my experience as a singer. And singers are very involved in the business of memory. I mean, one of the reasons I'm now going to read something to you is because although I perform a lot in public, I'm so used to performing things I've memorized that I find it very difficult to speak off the top of my head, which people often find as a surprise. But anyway, here we go. Most of my professional life is spent coaxing, confronting, and cajoling my memory. When I set out to learn and then perform something by heart, my initial reaction is a sort of recoil from doing it, a sort of fear. If it's an opera, that's fine, because usually the rehearsal period is very long, and I've been lucky to be mostly in productions where that rehearsal period has been certainly at least 3 weeks, sometimes as much as 7. Though I'm sure that's probably for a director not enough. It never is. And that gives time for the mental inscription of the piece to take place, as it does for an actor who often turns up for a rehearsal period not knowing the piece, I think. It becomes part of the business of putting the whole thing together, the stance, the movement, gesture, performing with colleagues, conductors, orchestra, the whole thing. And I think it's all mutually reinforcing. And so the memory side of things is pretty much taken care of. If I've agreed to sing some new songs, it's very different. There never seems to be enough time, and the prospect is quite intimidating, but the process is always pretty much the same. Sitting at the piano on my own, repeatedly singing my part, singing along to a recording, working with the pianist, playing my part with one finger or some of the simpler accompanying chords on the piano. I can't actually play the piano, but I can do this. It seems to piece itself together in whatever it is, my subconscious, my unconscious, I don't know what the right term would be. And then very quickly, much quicker than I ever expect, it gels suddenly and achieves a usable form. Coincidentally, that business with the one-finger piano playing tells you something about memory, I think, and the way things relate to each other. If I can play the tune with relative fluency with my one-fingered method, it usually means that it's also anchored in my head. And somehow the physical distances between the notes on the piano keyboard and the relationship between the black and white notes has some sort of subliminal physical relationship with my vocal mind and with my vocal cords. As I said, I'm not a pianist. I'm also not a great reader, by which I mean a reader of music. I can't look at a row of pitches and accurately render them, and I don't have perfect pitch. Learning music that falls into a recognizable style, a Bach aria, a Mozart aria, or a Schubert song, is a matter of part reading and part guessing on the basis of familiarity and expectation. And the vocal line is usually very easily absorbed into the mind as a tune, something you could walk along the street and sing. Contemporary music, by which I mean contemporary classical music, by which I mean stuff written after about 1907, is a different business on the whole. And many times the composer will write vocal lines which don't make easy tunes in the head, and which are disrupted rather than reinforced in the piano or orchestral accompaniment. But for me, the only way to absorb such music is endless repetition until it feels like an expressive and natural tune. And here I think the words are a help as well. I'm relearning a piece of difficult contemporary music at the moment, an orchestral work by Hans Werner Henze, which we premiered about 3 years ago. The process of relearning such a work tells us something about memory, I think. At first, most of it seems utterly unfamiliar, but with repetition, the old shapes begin to re-emerge. They were there, or many of them were, more or less deeply buried. My experience of singing that sort of music is that when I half know it, when I sort of know it adequately, so as to speak. There's a model in my head, and if I manage to hit it with my voice, I experience a sense of the key fitting the lock. When I really know the music I'm singing, any music, there's a greater sense of freedom and liberation. With a piece like Winterreise, Schubert's 24-song, 70-minute cycle, which I've been singing since I was 21 and which I've probably sung at least 100 times, I don't have to think about the music or the words. I can only compare it to what happens when you drive. You start out utterly and nervously concentrating on the process and end up perfectly able to have a complicated conversation with your passenger. Now, that isn't what I do in a concert. While I'm singing, I can turn the words and the music over in my head, look at the audience, think about things other than the actual business of delivering the words and music correctly and not getting lost. Getting lost or making a mistake in such circumstances is a bit like a collision or a near collision in a car. It breaks the flow of semi-unconscious motor activity. It's a jolt, and a different part of the mind suddenly kicks in. Talking about Winterreise also reminds me of the rather obvious truth that things I learnt when young, when I was in my 20s, seem to be far more solidly lodged in my memory than more recently learnt pieces, however routine they may have been. They have to be recovered laboriously, like the Henze, after a long gap. The old pieces are just there somewhere. In the case of vocal music, the more you have learnt, the easier recall is. The words, the melody, and the physical attitude are all mutually reinforcing. So my mind is stuffed full of reams of German poetry of various degrees of quality, which only the music gives me access to. I don't address the words separately. They are part of the music, the very sound of the words, I mean. Music absorbs the words, their physical quality, and a song is, for a singer, or for me at least, a single compound made up of and negotiated between consonants, musical pitch, speech pitch, musical rhythm, speech rhythm. Coincidentally, musical setting seems to destroy one of the prime musical, in inverted commas, features of poetry, one of the things that makes it easy to learn, which is rhyme. You don't really notice rhymes when you're singing poetry. How all this relates to how memory actually works is not surprisingly beyond me, but I'm inclined to believe, on the basis of my experience, that a machine model of memory, which is probably hopelessly out of date anyway, information laid down in some fleshy version of a computer drive, is inadequate to my subjective experience. Music and memory is a vast subject, but I'd just like to flag up two other areas quickly. First, actors of a certain school talk about emotional memory as being a crucial part of the method, sort of dredging up memories and of things that you've actually done and using them to feed your performance. As an actor in opera, I've never explicitly worked like this, though in recital, when I sing songs of piano, I've occasionally tried to give a sort of fillip to a performance that I feel is getting a bit flaccid by remembering horrible things that have happened to me to give myself a jolt. But in opera, I wonder if the emotional quality of the music and our immersion as acting singers in that provides the sort of emotional soundtrack that method acting finds in emotional memory. Secondly, and this is a sort of obvious point, musical form, whether it's in a simple pop song or in a Beethoven symphony, is utterly dependent on memory. We have to recognize something we've heard before, either simply repeated or recognizably changed for the music to work on us. And classical music, art music, call it what you will, works with this device of recognition as its basic stuff. And it goes even beyond this when the idea of a tradition kicks in and we can recognize quotations from pieces of music or in another piece of music, or a Bach-like theme or gesture in, say, a song by Robert Schumann. I think the problem for a lot of what I think is wonderful avant-garde music is that in making that process of recognition invisible for the common listener, it throws away its capacity to connect with a wider audience. Thank you.
Before moving on to Simon, I just wanted to ask you, Stephen, is there in Ian's description of how he learns his pieces, how important it is to have those tactile and relational, if you want to call them that, circles. Is there anything in the neuro side that you could give us as a gloss to what's going on?
I'm sure that there is, and I would actually sort of pick up not so much that, but what Ian was saying about emotional memory. I mean, there is very good evidence now that we learn and remember things much better if, in fact, they have an emotional rather than a purely cognitive content. That should seem obvious to everyone, but it was quite a surprise to the neuroscientists actually to discover it and also to demonstrate that a particular region of the brain near to the hippocampus, called the amygdala, is centrally involved in
the amygdala.
Amygdala,
yeah,
like almond.
Yes,
is
absolutely.
essentially involved in making those in those sorts of memories. If you try to train someone or ask someone to remember something in which you've cut out the emotion by giving a drug which will stop the emotional passage coming through the amygdala, it's remembered far less well. So that combination of things that Ian's describing, I'm sure are absolutely right. The reference, as it were, so the engagement of the body, the engagement of emotion, and the anything except assuming that the brain works like a solver of crossword puzzles or a computer seems to me to be crucial.
But there are people who remember numbers, and they have, I don't think, much emotional content. Is that?
I once did a gig with a professional memory man who remembered the entire Middlesbrough telephone directory, and he would tear the directory into pages and throw it out into the audience and would say, sort of, tell me a name, and he would read out the number associated with that particular name. Not a particularly useful skill, I think. And he did it by a technique he described, which goes right the way back to the ancient Greeks, and which I think many actors are also familiar with, and that is putting things in particular places, what's called memory theatres, and walking through them. But Simon may want to talk about that anyway.
I'm going to stop you just one more minute, Simon. I'm just interested in this link here, because your amnesiac in the Jonathan Miller film was in fact somebody who could still remember the music that he played. I mean, do you have, in your end of the work, any explanations for the fact that the music was as deeply buried, say, as language in him? I don't like using this buried metaphor, but that's where we get to with memory.
The playing of music is a perceptuomotor or procedural skill, and that is characteristically preserved in episodic memory disorders. You can't remember episodes from your life, but as Stephen gave the example of riding a bicycle, and this guy could still perform at a high level playing music. We have seen the opposite. Well, not quite the opposite, but I did have a patient who had posterior temporal lesions, and she was a musician, and she'd lost very specifically the ability to read music from the stave. She could play music from memory, her linguistic skills were all intact, but she could no longer read music from a very specific lesion. So that's the opposite in a way.
The terrible moment where Lisa turns to me and goes, Simon. I feel like a little bit like the cuckoo in the nest, because everyone else has very neatly typed notes and even presentations and a whole set of things that they are going to say. And as I said to Lisa, I'm going to busk it. I'm going to reach into my own memory and see what comes out. I mean, I was absolutely fascinated, so I want to start with what Stephen was talking about, and I was absolutely riveted because about 13 years ago, 14 years ago, I started trying to make a piece of theatre about memory. It wasn't called Mnemonic at that point. We didn't even know what it was called. And I began the piece eventually by saying, yesterday someone said to me, asked me why I was making a piece about memory, and I tried to remember. And then generally at that point people would laugh. You didn't laugh now, but that's fine. Now you did laugh, so I got the reverse joke, the secondary part of the joke, and on it would go. And I was fascinated by Stephen because here I am talking about memory, and it's in a series called The Mind and the Brain, I'm an actor, I'm absolutely not a scientist, but I am fascinated, just as Ian is, by science. And one of the things that I found absolutely gripping was reading about memory and how, the way that people thought about memory, for example, in the 19th century, and the fact that they thought that it did reside specifically somewhere in the brain. They even thought it resided in cells, specific cells. And of course, as we later discovered, it's not the cells that are important, but the connections between the cells, the synaptic connections, and that, as Stephen was talking about, the hippocampus is extremely important in, bless you, the hippocampus, I'm busking, the hippocampus is very important in setting these things off. Hippocampus, he said, amygdala is like an almond. Hippocampus, or as we know from the French, l'hippocampe, it means a seahorse, and in fact it looks a little bit like a seahorse. And I found this very interesting, this thing about emotional memory. That's to say, when you have a strong emotion, you're more likely to remember something. So if I give you a shock, for example, if I was to say, look, I've got this dark blue shirt, it is dark blue, or a light blue sweater on, probably in about a week, probably even tomorrow, you won't in fact remember that I've got a light blue sweater. But if, for example, I gave you a shock, if I went, suddenly and a few people leap, now it's more likely that you'll remember I've got a blue sweater, blue sweater, blue sweater. It's possible that now you'll remember something, because in this shock you'll get a little squirt, there'll be a little squirt from your hippocampus, and then a few connections will be made somewhere in the brain. And this, for me, is very fascinating, because not only was I interested in what Stephen was saying, I'm fascinated by the way that the history of memory research has arrived at this point, particularly the third point in the end of that Stephen was making, which was, I can't remember, each time we remember, we remake the memory and change the connections. Now, this is really interesting, because this way, there's a reason why I'm here, because in other words, every time we remember something, we're remaking the memory. We are creating the memory. Now, of course, this is extremely interesting, because from my point of view, I remember going back to, we all have the experience of going back to somewhere we've not been before, and when we get there, we go, but that's not as I remember it. Well, of course it's not as you remember it, because every time you've remembered it, you've slightly changed that memory, because that memory is being recreated every time you make it. So we're quite sure about what we remember, but in fact, each time it's a new picture. Now this, for an artist, is absolutely fascinating, because if memory is creative, it's essentially the same process as the imagination. And this was one of the fascinating things that performing this piece, Mnemonic, we toured it in various places, and in New York I encountered this man, Eric Kandel, and we had a long conversation, and essentially about this fact, about the fact that memory and imagination are the same thing. Memory is a creative act, and this notion of so the history of memory has taken us up to this third point that Stephen was talking about. Each time we remember, we remake the memory and change the connections. The brain is this incredibly fluid thing, and memory, if you like, is something that exists now, that we are creating now, but we're also remembering now. We are literally remembering. We're putting the members that we had back together. Each pattern is slightly different. Now, this interested me, and I took it a little bit further, and I remember going to a series of lectures by an anthropologist called Jack Goody in Cambridge. And what fascinated me, and I'll try and make a connection with this series of lectures as I'm busking along and trying to remember what it was I was going to say, because he started talking about, he has spent his life with oral societies. So oral societies, that's to say non-literate societies, societies that don't write things down, in which largely you would have thought memory would play an enormous part. Of course it must do, because they all have their stories, their epic stories of creation, their stories of definition. All their culture is based on storytelling, and stories that are repeated and refracted, and it tells them exactly who they are. And one of the things that he did when he was studying with these people in the early 50s, who were the tribal people called the Ojibwa in North America, he wanted to know their creation myth, and nobody would tell him. And eventually he managed to persuade an old man to tell it to him before he left. He was very pleased. He then spent, he got a doctorate as a result of it, and and really did very, very well, and wrote it up, and it became talked about for the next 20 years. And then 20 years later, he went back to the same tribe, and he was welcomed back, and he talked about, with one man late at night, he talked about the creation myth, and with an old man in the tribal, in one of the tribal gatherings, and this old man said, no, that's not the creation myth at all. He told you a complete lie. No, the creation myth actually goes like this, and he told him a completely different story. The next day he met somebody else who then told him a third story about the creation myth, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, until he was completely confused. And one of the things, this led him on to research memory within oral societies. One of the things he discovered was that he couldn't, nowhere in any research could he find any oral society that had a word for memory. There was a word for remembering, but not for memory. In other words, there was an implicit understanding that memory itself is something that is created each time. When I was filming recently, not recently at all, 5 years ago, when I was filming a film called The Last King of Scotland, and we were largely filming in Uganda, I was with a very remarkable Ugandan actor who'd grown up in a village, and an incredible man, who also had a theatre company, the same as I do, but that's a very long story. In fact, he had 167 theatre companies, but that's, yes, as I say, it's a long story. There are many different languages in Uganda, and each theatre company needed to speak in each dialect. Anyway, he was talking about growing up, and he said, in his village, in which storytelling was an incredibly important part. And one of the things, very remarkable things he said to me, was when I asked him about storytelling and about memory, he said, well, any myth that is related in our village, that's to say a myth about creation or how we came to be or who we are, it's always related as something that happened to the person who tells the story. So I was, in a garden the other day, and I was with my girlfriend, and she said, you've got to taste this apple. Yeah, you've really got to taste this apple. I said, no, I don't want to. We've been told we're not supposed to eat that. Yeah, no, but you've got to taste it. So I tasted it, and you know what? It was incredible. It was really incredible. And so this, in other words, what I find remarkable is that we come all the way through the history of discovering, scientific history of discoveries about memory, and there is perhaps somewhere on the edges of our world an implicit understanding of the nature of memory, very different from the one that our so-called 19th century scientists thought it was. And so in Mnemonic, for example, just to finish here, there is, I combined a story of memory with the discovery of the Iceman. I don't know if you remember the Iceman, who was discovered in 1991 on the border between Austria and Italy, frozen in the snow, and he turned out to be 5,300 years old. And they found a little thing that looked like a kind of amulet on the end of a piece of leather. And they thought, what is this? This is some strange sort of good luck charm. And eventually they analyzed it, and they discovered that it was a mushroom. And so they analyzed this mushroom. And it's 5,300 years old, and they discovered that it was a natural antibiotic. And so the last thing that I would like to say is we seem to remember a great many things, but it seems that as a society also we have forgotten a great deal.
Thank you so much. I mean, all that you say is fascinating. In fact, all that everyone has said is fascinating. Now we have to try and see if we can weave a few of these themes together and look at them from the various points of view that we're coming from. And one of the things that you said was that you pointed out how memory is very, very close to the imagination. Of course, this is repeated quite often because I think it comes from the same sources, or the same kinds of activity. But I wonder why it is that in so many cultures, and indeed our own, there is still this sense that memory is also a storehouse. This is before computers, before we have the sense that memory is actually lodged outside us into some kind of mechanical thing. And Stephen, and you, Michael, do you think there's any sense in which memory still is a storehouse, despite the plasticity that we're talking about and this constant reinvention and imaginative aspect that it also has?
Well, memories are stored, but they are constantly being reconstructed. So it's not a passive, it's not a photographic storage. And if you do tests, you can find that people make systematized errors, and actually within societies, it's the old Bartlett stuff that as you go around telling stories, they've become more and more walked away from the original. I just wanted to take up the point that you were saying we've forgotten, or culture forgets a lot of its past. Well, actually, in the individual, part of the function of memory is forgetting. Because if we took in everything, we would be a bit like a famous person that Luria wrote up. And he had so many memories that he couldn't think in abstract, constructive ways. So memory can get in the way, and the filtration mechanism is part of the normal processing of our memories.
When you think about memory for yourself, Ian, because you do have a repertoire, which means something that has been repeated in a sense and put down. I mean, do you have an image of yourself as containing this vast store?
I think so, but I think that's because I do have a very fixed. I have, something. The classical tradition is very fixed in that sense. There's a lot you can play with in terms of how you perform things. But the sort of founding myth of classical music is that you have this stuff written down on paper, you have words, you have notes, and you have to reproduce those, and there's something to measure them against. And you're very aware of that, for example, when you make a recording, because you mustn't make any mistakes, you mustn't change anything. The idea of the authoritative text is crucial. I'm going back to what Simon said. I mean, that seems to be the invention of writing and technologies that are akin to writing must surely change our attitude towards memory, because we actually have then something objective to measure it against, which is different maybe from comparing memories with your fellow man or woman, I don't know. But our attitude to memory must have changed since then, I suppose.
I'm going to ask you for questions in just one moment. I just want to ask Simon one more thing. I mean, Simon, you make things, but you also then enact them after you've made them. And presumably performances have something akin to one another over time.
They certainly do, yeah.
And they are, in that sense, remembered.
Yes, they are absolutely remembered. But one of the interesting things is that a theatre performance, a little bit like a memory, is different every time. It might be fractional, the difference. It might be so minute you'd need the most incredible, perhaps, the scientific, I mean, I'm talking about memories here, the scientific register is probably not invented to be able to show exactly how minutely the memory is different one from another. But certainly every single live show, yes, is different one from another. The key thing to it is that it happens in the present, that it's happening now. So the only thing that's interesting in terms of theatre is it alive or not? So the memory is just a template, and your job, or Ian's job, my job as an actor is to bring it alive. And I suppose, that's an interesting meditation on the nature of memory, because memory is supposed to be about the past, but I actually think it's about the present.
I think what you say is very interesting, because it seems to me that we've always invented technologies to do the job of straight remembering for us, straight recording, whereas we go on in our merry way and forget and reinvent. So,
yeah, can I come back on this question both of storage and the last thing that Simon said, sort of, in his busking, I should say, and that is, I think the issue of social amnesia is actually is a separate but a very interesting one. As societies, we do forget. An interesting book by a man called Russell Jacoby some years ago, indeed called Social Amnesia, which made a great impression on me. I'm coming back both to particularly what Simon and Ian were saying. I'm increasingly coming to the view that speaking of memory is a mistake, because it's a noun. Whereas what we understand is two things. We understand learning and we understand remembering, and both of these are active processes, they are verbs. So the question is still, where is the memory between the time when we learn it and the time when we recall it? And you saw the scans that Michael was showing of his patient, and talking about amnesias associated with the blocking of particular regions of the brain. It's so easy to think from that somehow the memory is stored in those regions of the brain which have been destroyed. Because if you've destroyed those regions, then you've destroyed the memory. But you could equally well be destroying the regions which are necessary for the memory to be evoked, without the memory actually being stored there. It's a famous analogy by Richard Gregory in the days when radios had transistors. And he said, if you take a transistor out of a radio and the result is that you get a howl rather than a Beethoven symphony, it doesn't mean the function of the transistor is as a howl suppressor. It just means you're looking at the function of the system in the absence of that part. And that's what we're really doing when we're trying to infer from a lesion in the brain to that is a part of the brain which is responsive, which is storing, as opposed to a part of the brain which is actively engaged in creating.
Yes, I mean, what I was saying was, and you were also saying, is that without the hippocampi, you cannot lay down new experiences. And many people now would argue that the hippocampi are also involved in the retrieval of old memories, although that is still controversial. But that doesn't mean it'd be very surprising if all memories were stored in these two tiny little bits of tissue. I have a seahorse in every house I live in, which we call Hippocampus.
I mean, presumably the process of learning something, what I do, which is sort of cudgeling difficult stuff into my head to remember it, that's different from involuntary laying down of memories, and maybe it could be a totally different process. I mean, it is, subjectively it's a totally different process. There's no reason
you describe it as a very physical process because of the way in which it
Yes.
It is. I sometimes work with a large group of actors, and it's a very simple exercise in which I ask people to remember words. So, I'm very tempted to do it now, but I won't. It's all right. I say, I'll say something like, sky, and then everyone says sky. Then I'll say cloud. Everyone says cloud. Then I say tree, and everyone says tree. I say, right, okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to say one word after mine. So I say sky, nobody says anything. I say cloud, everyone says sky. I say tree, everyone says cloud, and so on. I say, now you're going to do two words after me. And it's very interesting because I find that people remember very well provided you link them in a story. So in other words, it goes cloud, sky, cloud, tree, earth, root, I don't know, fruit, apple, and so on. And then if you suddenly say, absolutely after that, suddenly this, because it's a jump, you can't forget it. So then I say, well, let's make it even more difficult. Let's try it in Japanese. And everyone goes, oh, God, So then they do exactly the same exercise in Japanese. Strangely enough, it's always easier because there's no meaning attached. And the sound of the word, the rhythm of the word, is what is helpful to remember. And of course, that is very fascinating because people always wonder how people remember Shakespeare. That's because there is a musicality to it. and you can remember the musicality and the rhythm. Obviously, you have to understand the sense, but it's not just purely through, as it were, this sequence of words. Like it's not like your man who remembered the Milton Keynes. Was it the Milton Keynes directory? Yes, I was wondering whether I remembered right, or whether I was going to say Barnsley. That's my short-term memory. It's amazing. I just assumed I just plucked Milton Keynes. It's something different, and good writing for the theatre always involves a very, very fascinating use of rhythm. I mean, Beckett is actually very, very, very difficult. There's a beautiful rhythm to it, but it involves so much repetition and sensitive repetition. I did Endgame a few years ago with Mark Rylance, who's brilliant at learning things, but he found it almost, everybody finds it almost impossible. Very, very, very difficult to learn.
You wanted to come in, Michael?
Well, I'd like to mention this company, and I have to choose my words carefully, a study that John Morton and I did with a prominent actor who had got a problem, a memory problem. And he could not remember what plays he'd been in the past, or at the time we saw him, or large parts of his past, although he did subsequently improve. But we gave him passages from plays that he'd appeared in, and plays that he hadn't appeared in. And we also had some comparison actors without brain injury. And although he couldn't remember which plays he'd been in and which he hadn't, he learned much better at the ones he'd been in than the ones he hadn't. And he could learn, the rate at which he learned these lines was the same rate as the comparison actors. And one of the reasons he could do it, I'm sure, is that this man was quite exceptional at reading Shakespeare or prose passages. We put a piece in front of him, and he was superb. He passed it perfectly. And I'm sure it's all those old skills, the ability to see a passage of poetry or prose and read it perfectly, all those past semantic skills, and also the emotional content, which allowed him to learn so well, despite the fact that in everyday life he was struggling.
All right, we've got time for a few questions, one or two. Could you stand up, and a microphone will come to you, just over there. The woman on the far, my left. That is,
Stage right.
Stage right.
Okay, thank you very much first for your very fascinating talks. It was a pleasure to listen. My question relates a bit at the intersections of neuroscience and philosophy. So I'm wondering, when we consider memory and neuroplasticity and the concept of self, is self, in a way that we form our identity in terms of life stories, therefore in a more continuous time frame, an illusion, and it's a moment-to-moment illusion?
I think this is one.
A small subject.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, to me, you're absolutely right, and that is we constitute our identity through our memories and through our own autobiographical life story, which is why the conditions like Alzheimer's are so absolutely tragic, because the whole of one's identity tends to dissolve away because you lose that life story part of yourself. And what constitutes the life history through the years of our life, for me, is increasingly, as I keep trying not very coherently to hint at in what I've been saying, is process. It is dynamics. What holds us together is the dynamism of this continuous metabolic activity flowing through ourselves. It's not stasis, it's not things. One of the things that all infant biologists are taught is that a key concept in biology is homeostasis, staying the same. But stasis is death. What we need is homeodynamics, and it's that dynamic of our moment-to-moment life history which seems so important. And it's both simultaneously clearly real objective material, and at the same time recreated in the way that we keep talking about recreating memory. And that's, I suspect, why it's so elusive to talk about, especially within the Western philosophical tradition, which is so dualistic, so reductionist and thing-oriented, and so way of insisting on splitting into dichotomies all the time, and transcending that, I think, especially for someone who's trained, as Lisa said, in a most molecular sort of way, it's damn difficult.
Okay, cool. I think we'll take another, because there's several. There's one here, and then we'll go there. So take this one here.
With the issue of some amputees having phantom limb pains, would you say this is a result of a memory or something else? And if it's memory, how does it manage to instill physical pain?
It's a form of pain, yes. And there are various theories as to how to rise sees, but certainly it's a physiological memory that keeps recurring.
We're not going to go into PTSD now, I think, so we'll just take the one right in the middle, if you can get a mic over there, I don't know. And then here. Striped shirt, blue, right in the middle. Could you stand up? There. And then, Ellie, there's one here for later, wherever it was.
Could you say anything about how actual facts are stored in the mind? You know, Simon was saying number 167. Is there any understanding of how, if it's not encoded in computer terms, how facts are actually stored in that way? You know, beyond saying it's related to, you know, neuronal activity. Is there any understanding of how that information is stored?
Different sorts of information is encoded and stored in different places, so that, for example, words are stored in the temporal lobes and numbers tend to be stored in the parietal lobe, and you can have patients who have damage to one or the other. So we do have some crude ideas as to how they're stored, and the underlying process is a process of learning, reverberation, presumably, as Stephen was describing, Hebb-like reinforcement, what Hebb's phrase was, recurring circuits that then subsequently reignite, so to speak. But within the brain, different types of information are knowledge-based information are stored at different sites. Where episodes and incidents are stored is much more controversial, and we have only broad ideas about that.
I'm going to take one more question because I think we're going to have to sum up. There's just there. Would you stand up?
Thank you very much for all those interesting connections from all the speakers. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the connection between learning, remembering, and physical activity. I think Ian mentioned it a little bit when talking about using the piano. But I'm wondering about the research that suggests, particularly I'm thinking of young children, 4 or 5-year-olds, that kind of age. What's the connection and the help that physical activity can give to that learning and then remembering process? Thank you.
Stephen, if you take that.
Oh dear. I'm extremely sceptical, as are many neuroscientists, about the claims of what are called neurogyms for educational purposes. And I've seen pictures of things with kids of that sort of age and older doing exercises, touching bits of their body which they call brain buttons and so on. This is snake oil. And I think it has to be recognized as such. There's a huge industry building up in neuroeducation of trying to, as it were, sort of claim that neuroscientists know better than experienced primary school teachers about what helps kids learn. So I would take it with a degree of skepticism.
At the other end of the age scale, of course, there's a lot of stuff about if you do a lot of exercise, maybe you'll prevent your dementia. Well, possibly you'll slow it down to some degree, but that can be understood in terms of anything you do to improve your vascular system is going to help both your mind and your body.
That probably means we should get up and start
We
running
should all
about.
go and jog, go for a jog.
Well, I was going to ask the two people on my right, which is your stage left, going to?
I don't know.
Stage right.
Or whatever.
Audience left.
Just for the fun of it, how do you think you will remember this event tomorrow and in a year's time? Ian, you first.
As just out of the ordinary, not what I just something out of the ordinary. Yes, not what I normally do.
So, will you remember it or not?
Oh, I'll definitely remember it because I can't remember loads of concerts because they're all the same. But this is different.
Sam, you had the first word in the series. You're going to have the last.
Oh my God! Well, I suppose I will remember it because when you're on stage, normally you look into a sea of darkness, and here it seems that the audience, have their faces more illuminated than ours. So that's pretty scary, let me tell you. It's pretty scary. And as we know, blue shirt. That'll help me remember.
When I'm learning this difficult contemporary music, I'm going to get Simon to sit next to me and go.
Oh, I do, Ian. We just opened a contemporary opera at La Scala, and when they couldn't remember. No, that's not quite true. Actually, they remembered very well, very well.
Right, well, I'm going to put you all in a novel, I think. Thank you very, very much to Stephen Rose, Michael Kopelman, Ian, I've almost remembered your name, Bostridge, and Simon McBurney. Thank you very, very much indeed. And Lara, my co-coordinator, wants to just say a final word.
Yes, bookending the series. Just to say, really, thank you very much to all of you for coming, and lots of familiar faces who've come to lots of events. But particularly thank you to Lisa, who we brought in to King's as a visiting professor through the Wellcome Grant, and who's been a really wonderful colleague. I think often when you get sort of great names and faces to come into university, they expect to sort of do it all from a distance. But Lisa is the only person I've met who replies to emails as quickly as I do. Often they cross in the ether because we're both sort of onto the case slightly over assiduously. So it's been really wonderful working with her, and I'm delighted that it looks like we're going to carry on a little bit. Poppy Sebag-montefiore, our wonderful filmmaker who's filming there, is going to make an hour-long documentary based on the filming we've done in the labs and the talk. So that will be put on our website at some point soon. And in the meantime, the films of the discussions themselves will be uploaded. So if you've missed any, or if you've got friends who've missed them, then do look out for those. And as Lisa mentioned, we have Alan Francis coming in June. We also have Adam and Miles Jones coming to talk about disability in film in April. So email Brain and Mind if you'd like to, if you don't know about that and would like to come. And yes, I think we'll all remember tonight very vividly in a year's time. Perhaps we should put a box on the website where we can all note our recollection.
And the computer will remember it exactly when you download it.
So thank you very much to all of you and
thank
to
you,
all
Lara.
our wonderful speakers.
Thank you.
You